and what are the particular factors that are going to favor a particular language over another. Skutnap-Kangas and Robert Philipson have talked a lot about the spread of English, but when you follow the spread of English around the world, it's a heterogeneous history. What the position that English has occupied in North America and in Australia is not exactly the same position that English has occupied in India, in Nigeria, and in former British exploitation colonies. And it is certainly not the same position that English is occupying now, say, in Japan, in China, and so forth, as a lingua franca. And ecology is going to tell us, listen, a lingua franca is going to get in competition with a lingua franca. That's why La Francophonie is deadly worried about the spread of English, not because English is going to threaten French in France, but because English is getting in competition with French in Francophone Africa as a lingua franca, okay? And English is no threat to languages in India or to Nigeria and so forth, because in these places, English is just an official language. It is not a vernacular. In North America, English has endangered and driven to extinction so many languages, not just Native American languages, but also European languages. You know, France has lost the battle in North America. Spanish is coming back, but we don't know for how long in North America. And here ecology is telling us again, you can't just follow these things in a uniform way without discriminating one situation from another. You have to be very attentive to local factors and so forth. That's one thing. Now, we can look at it from an activist point of view. And that's the position that Skutnap-Kangas and Robert Philipson and Peter Milhäusler have adopted. And in other words, we have to go and help people and help them revitalize their languages and so forth. It is one thing to want languages to survive. It's another thing to create the ecological conditions under which languages can thrive. And this has been an embarrassment for linguistics. I posted a paper about this at my website. And linguists have been taken off guard like amateurs relative to this. We have no remedies to offer, because the real remedies would be to go and talk not to the victims, but to the people who have changed the conditions. And in some cases, we have to be very realistic, because we cannot recreate the conditions under which some of the languages can thrive. And linguistics should be embarrassed by the kinds of reactions that we have had also for different kinds of reasons. That when you look at it, we don't always have to look at languages as representation systems. We also have to look at languages as tools that help humans adapt to changing socioeconomic ecologies. And in many cases, languages have died, not because they are harming people that have abandoned them, but because they are making the same people more competitive. So, and the question here is, what solutions can we offer in the face of changing socioeconomic conditions that are going to keep the particular populations that have been affected competitive, and not force them to lose the battle simply because they cannot really command the language that should help them? So there are so many things going on here, and I have been contented with using ecology as an academic framework for articulating the issues so that people can understand where we are. Before you propose any kind of remedy, first you must know what the situation is and what your remedy can do realistically, or when, like a doctor, you should tell a patient, I'm going to send you back home where you can die peacefully because there is nothing I can do for you.
I'm afraid that I don't see any remedy in general. Tomorrow in my talk I will speak about some models where different subgroups communicate with each other, and it's usually the case that the larger group kind of gradually influences the smaller group. And with a colleague of mine, we made simulations, and other people have made similar simulations. What you typically get is the only way to keep the two separate, that means not to let the majority take over, is to minimize the communication between the two. If they are in different regions and there is little contact between them, but lots of contact within each region, then the regions keep their identity. But that is exactly the opposite of what globalization is doing. Globalization means that there are more and more contacts between the different groups, which means, in my view, that there is only one outcome, which is that everybody will speak English. The only way to keep it is to forcibly keep people separate and tell them, don't talk to the rest with the rest of the world, just talk among yourselves.
Right. So,
is it possible?
Can I respond to that?
Yeah.
Yes, I think we are speaking the same language more or less, because this is another embarrassment for linguistics. People have been seeing things just in terms of numbers. And when you look at the distribution of the population around the world, there are a lot of small populations which are still on the margins of globalization, which are not experiencing the kinds of things that we are worried about. If you travel around the world, you are going to find out that globalization has left a lot of people on the margins. The economic crisis that the West has been experiencing over the past 2 years, there are parts of Africa especially that have not experienced it, because in the first place they never participated in the progress of the world when things were better. This is not their problem. They just don't know what's happening. Yes, there are places where this is a problem. There are places where this is not a problem. But even where we worry, I'm not worried, but Philipson is worried. My friend Claude Agege is worried about English possibly becoming the only language of Europe. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon.
Not soon, but
because
goes like this.
Yes, what is happening is that English is becoming the dominant lingua franca in Europe. But English is not spreading as a vernacular in Europe. You know, you find a good example in Holland, for instance. You can live in Holland for years without learning a single word of Dutch and survive, because the Dutch are multilingual. But the Dutch also know when they can keep you out and speak Dutch, and if you are too lazy not learning Dutch, there are a number of things that you wouldn't know. So a lot of people have learned to become bilingual without necessarily losing a language. I grew up in that tradition where you speak 2, 3, 4 different languages, and every language has its position. And you know that in some contexts, it's not this language that you should use, but that other language. I think that's where Europe is evolving. We in Africa have known this for the past 200 years or so. And Europe is becoming acquainted with this. So that's not the kind of thing that I'm worried about. And one of the reasons is that just like globalization, colonization has not been uniform around the world. Colonization has proceeded in different ways too. So.
Well, I think that Professor Francis Halligan joined us. So I think he started already the dynamics of a dialogue. So we can just dialogue. And
well, I just wonder. Well, I wonder just
Well, there were so many points now you mentioned. I think, for example, English. English is spread. Mm-hmm. For example, people from Jamaica living in London, mm-hmm. sometimes among them speak in Jamaican English. So is this English spread, or how should we call this? Or if just as a point to think about, because I think there's nothing wrong with this when these people in Jamaica already have some kind of language which is their identity, and so we I think it's there's not necessarily anything wrong or with this, or if English would be in some part of the world, or Chinese, for example. Chinese in England, well, it has to be considered as a minority language, and it is under threat, although Chinese is a language with most speakers all over the world. So I think we are forgetting a lot of these things when we just name the language, only the language. We do not think in the people, we just think in the language. And the other point, well, there are so many examples for what Salikoko mentioned, that people are multilingual, and they do not lose their language for centuries. This happens overall, and as I know, in New Guinea, and for example in the region of Baupesa, although this is an exception because the Baupes people have different languages, different ethnic groups, and when somebody marries to another group, and they have to marry to another group because they consider that all of them as a group are brothers and sisters, and they cannot marry to brothers and sisters. So everybody is multilingual, and this is working in some way, and this special, well, and there we may say ecology, you know, because it's a special way. But just to see it in a way that ecology has to be preserved, or doing it like something good, just to bring people to have a better ecology. That's I think is the wrong term we are using, but not in the way just to analyze the situation and then look for what would be better for people, but keep human being in the center of our analysis.
Yeah, well, here too we are dealing with many issues, and I'm first of all grateful that Francis Elige has joined us here because this highlights another fold of the whole thing, complexity, and that's what we will be talking about tomorrow. But for tonight, you know, if we are talking about languages, and we think of languages as organisms or as species, as I prefer to refer to them. And then we say this particular linguistic species is endangered. And we should go about it the way environmentalists are going with endangered species. And so we have to determine whether the ecology of that particular language can be salvaged or it cannot be salvaged. So we can modify the ecology because we are worried about language. And that's why I said linguists have to be realistic. First, they have to determine whether there is something realistic that they can do, which they can recommend to people, who to talk to, and so forth. Very often, talking to the victims is just comforting them. It's not helping them a little bit. But when you talk about English spreading and then coming back to England in the form of Jamaican English or Jamaican patois, here what we have to bear in mind is the fact that any language that is spreading is actually winning a Pyrrhic victory because it is being transformed. It's not such a decisive winner because it is being modified by the languages that it has displaced. And in the case of Jamaican English, you know, it's similar to English in India, it's similar to English in Nigeria, and it's similar to English in the United States. We have so many Englishes around the world today. It is reminiscent of the history of the expansion of Latin. You know, you guys here know. We outsiders say in Spain people speak Spanish until you come to Spain, and then you know Catalan and Castilian and whatever are not exactly the same. And, you know, that's your problem, whether you want to call them separate languages or what. Now, Jamaican English has acquired some sort of autonomy. And things have evolved to where that English in the Caribbean is coming back to England. Here too, ecology is very useful. How well are the Jamaicans integrated in England? And what explains why when Jamaican patois comes back to England, it can preserve this particular kind of identity instead of just being dissolved in the mother language, so to speak, the language in the birthplace of English. And this is an interesting phenomenon. And what is also interesting is that there is this other factor known as crossing, and the work of Ben Rampton. The people that are not of Jamaican descent who choose to speak like Jamaicans and so forth, what are the dynamics that are driving this? And so if you approach things ecologically, you are forced to ask all sorts of questions that show why a language is evolving in such a non-uniform way, why there is both spread and differentiation when a language is spreading, and why prestige is not the only factor that determines whether or not a language maintains its vitality. So it's so many different things that we have to pay attention to, and it just comes down to, I'm going to say two things now. One is, what is the ecology of language evolution? And that comes with how many different questions do we have to ask. And the second thing is what we are going to focus on tomorrow. What are the dimensions of complexity in language evolution? And I think the good thing now that we are learning is that linguistics, those people dealing with the diachrony of a language, they don't have to do it in an isolated way, not paying attention to discoveries in other disciplines. We are realizing now that you cannot do language history or language diachrony in the Newtonian physics way. We are opening up to people like Francis, who are bringing us new ideas about complexity and so forth, and we are thinking about how to apply those ideas to language. But how? You know, like I'm copying things from evolutionary biology, but I cannot just bring in the whole package like that. It doesn't work. A linguistic species is not like a biological species. And if you know about anything about biology, biology is very diverse. You cannot study the evolution of animal biology in the same way that you study the evolution of a particular virus, because the ontogenetic properties are different and so forth. And so in the end, maybe I said too, it just comes back to the ecology again. It's so many different questions that you really have to ask in order to understand things. So it's a useful framework. Maybe we are opening a can of too many worms, But we better be confronted with the questions and be more realistic rather than oversimplify things where we are not really helping anybody. Okay.
Thank you. Well, I think now we can just not to follow strict rules. Now we are already, let's say, hot among us. So I don't know if you want to ask questions or now we start a dialogue.
Well, if we're supposed to have some sort of dialogue, I would say that we've got plenty of evidence that English is right now not replacing languages all over Europe, and I think we only have to think about immigrants in Denmark, in the Netherlands, in Switzerland, in Finland, even here in Catalonia. They are not switching necessarily to a majority language such as English or German or French. Those would be the majority languages in Europe. They are switching to the languages spoken by their peers, which is a clear clue to one of the main elements that should be taken into account, in my view, when we are talking about language evolution. It is not from a macroeconomic point of view that we are predicting the particular evolution of every single community. We should pay attention to local ecologies. That's one of the points that I would like to be reflected in models, because otherwise one would not understand what's going on, let's say, here in Catalonia. In Catalonia, 1 out of 3 Castilian native speakers is transmitting Catalan to their children. It is their second language, but they are transmitting that language to their children. Why? We don't know exactly why, but mostly because of intermarriage, and probably they are making a sort of a calculation. They're saying, since my children will eventually learn